Hello and welcome.
Hey, everybody. We're doing this as a webinar this time.
Very exciting.
We're glad you're coming to join us.
Folks are just trickling in. It takes a little while for everyone to be let in. So I'm just watching the numbers of attendees go up. And once it slows down, then we can get started. But welcome and good evening to you all.
Well, and any of you who were in the last huddle, you'll know why we're doing this as a webinar. We had a Zoom bombing incident and decided that this might be the best way to handle that. It does make it a little different. And that means, yes, you can all chat to one another, but you can't see each other. And then there's the Q&A. So if you have questions for either Amanda or Jessica today, put them in the Q&A. That's where I will be looking, and Tiffany's helping out with that. We'll be looking. So thank you all. And I think Michael Barron's helping with that.
Yes, we have lots of helpers tonight. We want to say thank you. And we are going to welcome our speakers tonight as well. Amanda will be on in 5, which is great. So I think probably we can get started. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We're doing this as a webinar this time, so we are not subjected to any nasty Zoom bombing as we have experienced in the past. Just a quick look at what we plan to talk about tonight. Of course, we are welcoming you all, and we're going to give you a little very, very short update about HJR 1, House Joint Resolution 1. And then the main event, Catherine will be interviewing Amanda Gonzalez and Jessika Shipley from Colorado. They will have a chance to introduce themselves, and we will have lots of questions, time for your questions. We'll have a short update about the GOP lawsuit at SCOTUS, and then we're going to invite you to a wonderful panel that's happening next week. So basically, without further ado, I want to just quickly update you about HJR 1. This is the bill that was known as HJR 6 that came up during lame duck and that we managed to kill or at least postpone during lame duck. And the good thing about that is it will not be on the May ballot. But it was reintroduced as HJR 1, and HJR 1 is actually worse than HJR 6, and it would raise the required pass rate for any ballot initiative from 50 to 60%, as well as adding other obstacles. Those obstacles are very significant. They are specifically that rather than having just to collect 5% of the gubernatorial vote in 44 states, 44 counties, we would have to collect 5% of the gubernatorial vote in full 88 counties. In addition, it would remove the cure period. Right now, you can collect signatures, submit them to the Secretary of State, they get validated, and then if you're short, you get another 10 days to try to make up the difference. And HJR 1 would remove the cure period, so even if you were 1 signature short after you turned in, and that, of course, that wouldn't be because you'd failed to count. That would be because someone had moved and not updated their voter registration. So, it would really make it extremely difficult to pass any kind of ballot initiative. Even though there is not a hearing scheduled right now, we are very concerned that this bill could be put forward and passed through both houses, both chambers, in order to get it either on the November ballot or even conceivably on the May 2024 ballot. So we want to make sure that the public hears our ideas about HJR 1 before they hear the bad reasoning that we feel that they're using to put forward this bill. So our reasoning is very clear. Our message is very clear. It's unfair, undemocratic, unpopular, and unnecessary. And in order to share those ideas, we have a letter to the editor tool that we are sharing with you, and we hope that you will use to basically just spread the idea far and wide that, this is not a good thing to try to make it hard. Ballot initiatives are hard enough as they are. And why are we talking about that here? Because of course, a ballot initiative is the way that we're going to get redistricting reform, and we can't have it be impossible. That just isn't good. So make use of those links. And that is it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. And I'm actually in a minute going to stop sharing my screen so you can actually see the people here. Catherine.
All right, well, I wanted to start out by introducing you to Jessika Shipley. Now, during 2020 and 2021, she was the staff director, and this is a little different. So Jessika, I don't know if you know this, but we have heard from folks from Anthony Eade from Michigan. He was served as a commissioner on the Citizens Redistricting Commission in Michigan. We also had an opportunity to hear from somebody who served on the California Independent Redistricting Commission. And so, what I'd like to highlight is that as opposed to just one, there are actually two independent redistricting commissions. So that makes Colorado a little bit different. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight is that, one, we are just so incredibly grateful that Jessika is making time for this. Now, you all are likely familiar with the Legislative Service Commission. Jessika serves as the on what is essentially the research arm for the state legislature in California. She's what's called a special project manager. And so it's similar to the nonpartisan body that is our Legislative Service Commission. She has a background in political science, so she has a master's in political science. She's a Colorado native, and we're just really pleased that you were able to join us today, Jessika. And Jessika, I guess my first question, and I'm sure Mia's going to highlight you in just a moment, so be prepared for the spotlight on you. Right. The first thing I'm going to ask is for you, to tell us a little bit about yourself. People are interested in kind of background, how did you get interested in politics? So you can go back as far back as you want, but we're also interested in how did you come to care about redistricting? And just, give us a little bit of information about yourself.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. Let's see. I had a class in high school called American Problems that was essentially a current events class, and it was the best class I've ever taken, bar none. The teacher really got us interested in what was going on in the world and how, we could affect that. So as soon as I took that class, I knew I wanted to major in political science. So I did that. I got my bachelor's in political science, and then I got my master's in political science. And while I was doing my master's, I did an internship at the state capitol with a senator, a then sitting senator. And her good friend was one of the directors of the office that I now work for. And she said, after we had talked for a while, this is what you really want to be doing. You want to be nonpartisan staff. You don't care about the politics. You care about the governance. And so that's what I generally tell people, that I work in government. I don't work in politics. So for 17 years, I've been nonpartisan staff. Our office, beginning in 1974, was the staff for what was then called the Colorado Reapportionment Commission, which did legislative redistricting, not reapportionment. So it was a little misnamed, but and when 2011 came along, I had the opportunity. I put my name in and said that I wanted to staff that reapportionment commission, do the legislative redistricting for the state. And at that time, we had a commission, but it was appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, legislative leadership, and the governor. So it was a partisan commission, and it was half Democrat, half Republican, and then there was an unaffiliated voter who was the chair of the commission. And politics played a huge part in that commission's work, despite the fact that it was a bipartisan commission. There was just a lot of political behind the scenes activity that happened that then made it into the maps that wasn't necessarily fair or, particularly democratic in my opinion. But so in 2018, and I know you'll be hearing from Amanda soon, she was one of the people that really worked on this. 2 ballot measures were put on our ballot, and they created the 2 different commissions, one for congressional redistricting and one for legislative redistricting. And again, our office was tasked in the Constitution with staffing those. And so since I'd done it in 2011, and I was, in a position to do it again in 2021, I actually went into our director and said, I'm going to do this. And she said, okay. So that's kind of how I got where I am.
So one of the things that's interesting is, do you have a sense of why it was, why there were 2 commissions rather than 1 commission like many other states have? And like whether you thought that was effective, and just a little bit about that would be really interesting.
Sure. So, like I said, we've always had the legislative redistricting done by a commission. The congressional redistricting was always done by the legislature. And in the last 4 cycles, most of those maps have been rejected by the courts, the ones that were done by the legislature, or there's have been several instances where there was no map agreed on at all by the legislature, and excuse me, the court had to draw the maps. And so I think Amanda's group and people, like-minded people, were really interested in having something that would actually result in maps that had been carefully considered and weighed in on by the public, and just really more of a transparent process for both of the types of redistricting that we do. And so that's why the 2 commissions were created. And I think the protections were put into the Constitution in order to try to create as much transparency as possible.
What is the partisan makeup of the commissions?
So each commission has 12 members, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 3 unaffiliated voters.
Is anyone prohibited from serving on the redistricting commissions?
Yes, there are several people. So you need to be an active registered voter in Colorado. You cannot be a current or recent political office holder. You can't be current or recent employees of political office holders. You cannot be a current or recent lobbyist. Obviously, you can't serve on both commissions. We need to have 1 commissioner on each commission from each of the current, at the time, we had 7 congressional districts. We got an 8 with the census, the most recent census. We couldn't have more than 2 commissioners from any 1 congressional district. And then we needed to have at least 1 commissioner from the Western Slope. So, which is across the mountains and not in the, more urban area of the state. So there were a lot of sort of guidelines put in place to make sure, to try and make sure that, sort of seasoned political operatives were not put on the court or on the commissions to do the bidding.
Were donors prohibited, or, we would call them kind of political hacks? Well, that's the other question.
So part of the questions that were asked when we had the application out there was about political donations. We did some vetting of it with information that was available with the Secretary of State. I think Amanda would tell you that we didn't do enough. She helped us craft a lot of the questions that we put on our application, and tried to get us more towards a place where that sort of donation situation was more evident. And we kind of did what we could, but I think we could do a better job going forward.
Well, it looks like Amanda wants to jump in. Mia, would you be willing to spotlight Amanda as well? And I will ask you a little bit, to jump in and say, what you thought about the selection process.
I think I blocked some of this. It's so funny. I started laughing when Jessica said that because I was like, oh, that's true. I do remember that. We did do that. But I think in all things redistricting, right? It's a ton of work when you're in it. And I think we all wipe some of it from our memory. But yeah, so good to see everybody. And
Yes.
I think you may have covered, but I come from the advocacy side. I'm the former executive director of Colorado Common Cause, and was recently elected to clerk and recorder in Jefferson County, Colorado. So I apologize. I had some elections meetings that I had to attend that ran a little bit late. So glad to be here now.
Well, no worries. So I'm going to kind of keep, asking Jessica lots of questions, and then I will start asking you questions. And it is true, there's a period of the redistricting, and we of course went many, many rounds of map making, where there's a point where I'm like, was that round 3? Was it 4? I don't know what happened anymore. I have to go back to my notes. So Jessica, what I'm interested in has to do with the selection process. Now, who did folks send their applications into? Who was kind of the selection or vetting entity?
So our office, the staff for the commissions put together an application process that was then subject to a public comment phase where we sort of rearrange the questions and tighten some things. And then we put that out on a website that we created specifically for redistricting. We gathered all of the applications and made sure that they were real people, that they were registered, that they, all of the things that they said, the things that were required by the Constitution were all true. We, went through the Secretary of State's database and matched people. And once we had our total number of eligible applications, it's a very complicated process of winnowing things down. But there were 3 judge panels, one for the Congressional redistricting and one for the legislative redistricting, and they're retired judges from either the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, and they were tasked with looking at the totality of applications, which is generally 450, even though many, many more people applied. But the selection process in the Constitution kind of winnows it down to about 450 for each party. And so for Democrats, Republicans, and
you said 450 per party and independents, correct?
Yes.
That's a lot of people.
It was a lot of people. Yes, it was a lot of people. So we made those applications available to these 3 judge panels, and they had meetings where they winnowed it down even further. And so they chose 6 members of each commission, and then the other 6 members of the commissions were chosen by a bingo ball. I actually bought a bingo ball cage, and we chose numbers that corresponded to, were randomly assigned to each of the applications that were still in the pool, and chose the other 6 members. So yeah, I have these 2 big gold bingo ball cages that we used to do that on a live Zoom, so everybody could see what was happening.
So one of the things that I wondered about that you mentioned had to do with kind of public input on the application process. How did you gather public input throughout the map making?
So we did a roadshow. We created a preliminary plan as required by the Constitution. And I have to tell you, things were just a mess because of the pandemic. So our census numbers were late, and we didn't have them when we needed them, and so we had to create sort of a roadshow that was based on this preliminary plan, and then create plans that were based on actual numbers that came in August 16th. So everything that was created before was just based on numbers that we put together from the census, preliminary numbers from the census, our Office of State Demography, and other sort of sources. And we put those together, created a plan, and then we took that out on the road. So the commissioners actually traveled to about 40 different locations around the state that we put together, and had public meetings where anybody who wanted to would come sign up to testify. They would come and they would say their piece about what they thought of the preliminary plans, or what they thought was important, what their communities of interest were, and why something should go a certain way and not another way. And we also had a portal on our website that allowed people to submit written testimony. We got 6,000 different, pieces of written testimony. We had 40 meetings, and we had over 1,000 people testify over that course. There were some meetings of the commissions when they were in the middle of the map making process that we took public testimony at the actual Zoom when we were working on things. So there was a lot of opportunity for people to provide written testimony or public input.
Did people also provide, suggestions? Like, did they submit maps and community maps, and how did that work?
Yeah, we have a map gallery that our GIS folks put together, that any map that was submitted from anybody in the public or any member of the commission or anybody else, anybody can submit a map, and we uploaded all of those to the map gallery, so everybody had access to the same data and information. And the commissions both created several subcommittees to work on map drawing and public relations and several other things. And so the map making subcommittees really worked hard on reviewing all of those maps and making sure that they fit with the constitutional criteria, and then sort of trying to make everything fit, because a lot of times people, I don't know if this happens in Ohio or but a lot of times people want to just give you a partial map, and obviously that's a tough one. So because everything has to fit in the grand scheme of things, and so there was a lot of work at reviewing everything that was submitted to us, but then trying to figure out how to fit it in and make sure that those communities of interest felt heard and were able to be represented on the map correctly.
Now, did you do many kind of virtual testimony, virtual meetings?
People could testify virtually. I mean, one good thing about COVID, honestly, was that this proliferation of Zoom meant that people were willing to do this, and we created, we had the technology to do this. So anybody could testify at any meeting, either virtually or in person. So that's why I'm saying we had 1,000 people testify, because people were able to do it virtually or in person.
Well, the other thing that I kind of wondered about had to do with kind of the role of politicians, and we got a question from John that I noticed in the chat that had to do with kind of the lack of, shall we say, impartiality, shall we say, with some of our judges here. And I just, the question really was, what was that a challenge? But I also wondered, what kind of role was available for the usual political types? How was the governor involved? How were Congress people involved? What kind of boundaries did you establish? How did that work?
So I will tell you that I worked pretty closely with the judge panels, and they took the criteria in the Constitution very, very seriously. Their meetings were held in public. They were all broadcast, and as they spoke about their reasoning about choosing somebody or not choosing somebody, it really had to do with what the criteria in the Constitution required. So I mean, you can say that judges are impartial or not, but that's sort of the best. I think Amanda will tell you, when they were creating the compromises that created the two measures, they did the best that they could. And I would say that in terms of the role of politicians, we treated politicians just like anybody in the public. They were allowed to get up at a public meeting and say whatever they wanted to say. They could submit written comments. They could do whatever they wanted to do, as long as they, when they were testifying, they said, I'm a lobbyist, or I'm a, a politician. And it really identify themselves in that way. And if they didn't do that, then the commissioners basically were unwilling to hear anything that they had to say. If they heard later that somebody, was not quite honest with them, and didn't disclose what their role was, then, they were unwilling to suffer that for the most part.
Now,
I'm sorry I'm not loud enough. I hope.
Oh, fortunately, we have the ability to turn you up.
Okay.
When in person, sometimes you're like, okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wondered had to do with paying the commission. So like one of the things that we've kind of gone back and forth on has to do with paying the commissioners. Were the commissioners paid?
They were, and they were paid a per diem for each meeting that they attended. And then they were also paid, we picked up any and all hotels or meals or things like that were related to meetings or related to their work. But they were able to charge mileage for traveling to and from meetings. So expenses were paid and a per diem was paid. I will tell you that, in my opinion, that created a pool of candidates who was able to, take time away from a job, and survive and do a lot of work. This was a lot of work, and the amount of time that they put in. If you were not, independently wealthy or retired or something like that, then it would be a financial burden on you, because it was really condensed between March and September. Those people couldn't just have a normal work life at all. And so I think that's a shortcoming of the way we structured it, is that it generally excludes young people or people of financial circumstances that aren't independently wealthy and above. So I think that was a tough one, and I think a lot of things made it tough. Obviously, COVID was the number one, flashing lights, terrible thing, but other things made it difficult, and I think that was one. I think that's why our pool of candidates was so small.
Well, Amanda, it looked like you want to jump in on that one.
I couldn't agree more. That we did not have a means of meaningfully paying our folks that were on these commissions, and I absolutely think that it meant that we got less diversity than I think we would have liked to have seen, and certainly diversity of economic status, because it really was a full-time job, especially in the condensed timeline this round. I know that as an advocate, I was tracking it and trying to be on all the meetings, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't listen in on all of those subcommittee meetings, because there were just so many of them. And so if you were somebody that was trying to work a full-time job or, get your kid through kindergarten during COVID, I think that would have been really difficult.
All right, Jessica, I think we're almost to the end of my grilling you. So one of the things I wondered about really has to do with kind of the specifics. One of the things that, when we imagine this commission, we're trying to figure out, like, well, how did it work with the staff? Did you hire additional map makers? Were the commissioners themselves in there, with their mouse, and how did it practically work when it came to actually the creation of the maps?
So the staff is required to come up with a staff map at each phase of the map making process. So we were required to create a preliminary plan and then 3 versions of a map before it was submitted to the court. And if the commission could not agree on a map after the 3rd iteration, then our map would have gone to the court for approval. So staff spent a lot of time mapping, and we had a staff of 12 people to begin with, and I ended up hiring another GIS analyst and, some more IT people and a public relations firm. And so I ended up adding to that staff quite a bit. And the commissioners absolutely did plenty of mapping in their subcommittee meetings. And they generally had our GIS expert, Louis Pino, available to help them through the technical parts of using the Esri software. But they did a lot of mapping on their own, and it kind of was a matter of, commissioners would create a map and then bring it to the commission and say, this is why I did this X, Y, and Z. Or some commissioners would take our iteration of the map and make adjustments to that. So it was really a collaborative process, I think, between the commissioners and the staff.
So final thing, any advice for states that are thinking about moving forward with establishing an independent citizens redistricting commission?
I think it would be a better idea to have one more unaffiliated voter. I think having an even number of commissioners made some things very difficult. And I would prefer to be able to pay them. I think that would be better. I would also, something that I'm going to try for next time is creating the schedule for the tour, around the state before we do the application. So people have an idea of where they're going to be when and what their time commitment will be and at what time of the year. Obviously, we'll present that to the commission and ask for approval, and it might change. But I think a lot of the reason that we didn't get as big a pool of candidates as we could have is that people didn't know what to expect, and we weren't able to tell them because we didn't know what to tell them until after the commissions were convened. So I think those kinds of things would have made our candidate pool bigger. I think having some payments so that the diversity in financial situation and in age and career, all those kinds of things could have been there. And I mean, certainly for me, we spent $2.8 million for the entire thing. I will know better to ask for a whole lot more money than that next time and explain, I've written pages and pages and pages of notes about why it would be better for the state if we had spent more money on it. So I think that's what I would recommend, is looking very carefully at your budget and maybe padding it more than you think you're going to, especially because of the legal challenges and legal fees being so expensive. And then also having an adequate staff to shepherd this thing through the entire process, from the application process to the commissioner selection process to the training of the commissioners. We did a lot of training of the commissioners on what everything meant, and then the map making and the road show. It was all a lot.
Well, thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to interview Amanda. If you hear something, you can jump in, just like I encouraged Amanda to do so. And then there'll be some additional questions that I'm trying to include some of the questions, but I will do some additional questions at the end for both of our wonderful guests from Colorado. And with that, so yeah, one of the things that is really cool is Amanda had the same job that I have in Colorado. And so some of us will remember that she came on to kind of talk about kind of their vote by mail system, just the sheer number of drop boxes, a lot of the kind of administrative, ways that worked. So we're just glad that Amanda is back with us today, and she has a new job. And so I'm hoping that Amanda can tell us a little bit about her new job. And also, I guess the biggest question is, tell us about you and a little bit about how you came to care about redistricting. And anyway, with that, I'm just going to hand it to you to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so good to see both of you. I feel like Jessica and I were on Zooms like all the time for a couple months, and it's been a while. So good to see you. Yeah, so Amanda Gonzalez, like I said, former executive director of Colorado Common Cause, which was the role I was in when we were going through this redistricting process, and then recently elected as the Jefferson County Clerk and Reporter, where I oversee our motor vehicles department, our reporting department, and I think most importantly, elections for a county of about 450,000 voters. So really excited to be in the new role. And, it's sort of fun because I helped to write some of the laws that, now govern our elections, and I get to implement them as the clerk and recorder and get to see what I screwed up. So it should be a good time.
This is what I get, 2023, and I still can't figure out mute. So, one of the things I wondered about was, were you involved with map making, redistricting in 2011?
No, so I was in law school in 2011, and I don't think that I fully realized that redistricting was even happening, right? If you're just sort of an average person who's going to school or working a job or taking care of your family, this isn't top of mind. And so it was really interesting when we were trying to help recruit people to apply to be commissioners. We had to explain what redistricting was to a lot of folks because I see that there's a large number of folks on this Zoom call, which I assume y'all are some nerds, but not everybody is. So they're
Redistricting
not.
nerds unite.
Yeah, and so that was definitely hurdle number one, was helping people understand the process by which we decide districts and ultimately who's going to represent you, at the state level and at the national level.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the citizen-led effort to change the way that you did map making? What led to it? What was it like to try to plan that kind of campaign?
Uncomfortable. So I was one of the drafters of amendments Y and Z, but there were 16 of us around that table. So this definitely wasn't one person or one organization that were driving it. The interesting thing is, I think that people and organizations were participating for wildly different reasons. There were partisan folks and partisan organizations at the table that obviously were interested in creating a system that would work really well for their team. And there were also advocates at the table, like Common Cause, who were trying to get fair and transparent processes in place. And that made for some awkward meetings and some awkward drafting because, our goals didn't always all line up. And I think that's actually one of the nice things, and why I think it is harder to game the process, is because you had a group that didn't trust each other that were drafting. And so as we were drafting, how do these commissioners get chosen? You were saying, okay, how do I create rules that the person across from me, can't take advantage of? And so, as Jessica mentioned, part of the process was literally pulling names out of like a bingo ball. I don't even know what those things are called. Because that was a process that we felt like couldn't necessarily be gamed by one side or the other or by special interest.
Now, how long did it take for you to come together as a coalition?
So coalition is right. I think there was probably at least two coalitions at that table, right? There were good government groups who, like I said, were looking for transparency, and there were other interests around that table. This was months and months of drafting, and Jessica probably mentioned, but put these amendments together, and then brought them to our legislature, who had to refer them to voters, and then voters had to ultimately approve the change to our constitution. So that was a pretty long, drawn out process.
Now, what were the groups, when you say good government groups, who were they?
It was funny because right before this call, I was trying to look up and see if I still had lists, and I could not find them. But so Common Cause was there, League of Women Voters was there. Around the drafting table, there was an unaffiliated voter organization or group. And Jessica, jump in here if you can remember better than I can some of the groups that were in the drafting process. I know there were a lot more that got involved once the commissions were forming.
Yeah, I'm not remembering a lot.
Mhm.
Because there was the 2016 measure that got put on the ballot and then it failed. And then the one in 2018, and I think those were some of the some similar people, but the one that ultimately ended up winning, it was a lot of groups. So I can't remember last week. So
So one of the things that I was interested in, it was the choice to do kind of two amendments rather than one. So, we also were looking at, state legislative and congressional map making. Why did you choose to do two different commissions? And did you think that was a good idea, like once in implementation?
We really legally had to, because they were dealing with two different subject matters. One was about federal redistricting and one was about state redistricting. And so we legally in Colorado needed to do two separate ones. It created obviously two different commissions. And I think that for the amount of work that the commissioners had to do, it was nice that there were two separate ones. I think for the amount of work that the staff probably had to do, that was probably horrendous. Uh, for advocates who were trying to track two processes, that was somewhat difficult. And we actually had instances where even sort of internal policy wise, or what the commissions were looking at, differed between the two groups because of decisions that they made. So it definitely can get unwieldy to have two of them. And also we would have, I think, maybe been asking for an impossible amount of work for each commission if we'd been asking them to draw both sets of maps.
So can you tell me a little bit about like what you considered sticking points during the kind of process of process of negotiation, and what you think, oh my gosh, I think we could have done better?
Yeah, of course, what we could have done better is always the more top of mind one. So we fought pretty hard for both the, when I say we, I mean Common Cause and affiliated groups. We fought pretty hard for transparency in the process. Jessica mentioned that all of these were public meetings that, and thanks to the pandemic, you could Zoom in for them or you could listen to a phone call. And we felt like that was really important. We had a number of rules about who could apply to be on the commission or who would be able to be on the commission. So we excluded folks like lobbyists, like people that were current elected officials or had recently been elected officials. And I think that that was really, really important. Fundamentally, we wanted to create a process by which people are selecting their politicians, not the other way around. And we were trying to get politicians kind of out of the process. And so I think that criteria for who was eligible was really important. We had some stuff in there about how long you had been registered to vote that excluded very young people because eligibility to vote to the time of the commission, which, I heard from some groups they were a little upset about if they would have liked, 20-year-olds and 18-year-olds to be eligible to apply. So I thought that was interesting and maybe something we should have thought about better. We did have lobbying disclosure requirements around if you were lobbying the commission, but I think a lot of those lacked teeth, and we needed some teeth on the back end. I know that when the commissions first started, I registered as a lobbyist for redistricting purposes, but there was like two of us that had actually signed up in the first couple of weeks, and I was like, oh, I know that there is more people doing lobbying, and we all know that, but I think we got closer at the end, but would have been nice.
I hadn't thought about lobbyist registration and redistricting, but absolutely that. So this was another thing that I have wondered about, and it has to do with the Voting Rights Act. How was that handled? Do you have any kind of recommendations for a state like Ohio that's thinking about that?
Yeah, so we had actually submitted an amicus brief to the court because we didn't feel like there was a thorough enough job done around a Voting Rights Act analysis. So I think there really should have been an independent third party coming in and looking at the impacts of the VRA. I also would have loved to see the commissioners get a more in-depth training around the Voting Rights Act, what it required, and the ways they should be looking at this. So I thought that was a place that we could have improved.
Mhm. All right, well, final advice for Ohio, anything else?
Some of the same things that Jessica mentioned, in addition to a budget for paying commissioners, so that they could, take a leave from their job or whatever they needed to do, and that you could get that diversity. So absolutely would have created a budget for that. In a perfect world, I would have had a budget for outreach. It was a bunch of nonprofits and, some special interest groups that were doing a lot of recruiting to get people to apply to the commissions. And I would have loved to have seen the governing body themselves be able to have a budget to do outreach that was more independent, so that we had everyday people. Common Cause was doing their best, but I didn't have budget for it either. So I would have an outreach and communications budget, absolutely, that could go in place early and often. That voting rights amendment stuff. And then another thing that the commissions actually ended up disagreeing on was around prison gerrymandering. So we had one commission that said we're going to count prisoners one way, and we had another commission that said we're going to count them a different way. And I think that was illustrative of the fact that, we didn't think through everything. So the fact that we could get commissions with two different outcomes on that matter was really interesting.
Absolutely. Now, Jessica, I'm going to ask you this question. Was the process popular with the public?
I think the public they appreciated the ability to comment and to provide input on the maps. I think there was a lot of suspicion that there was still something shady going on in the background. And I'm sure there was, honestly. I have to tell you that I said before, I'm nonpartisan staff, and I tend to be very naive about political things, but I know that, we tried our very best to be very, very transparent. And I know there were still situations that didn't make it to the light of day. So there was, obviously the measures passed by 70% of the voters. So that part, the idea of it was very popular. The measures themselves are fairly detailed and specific. And so they were complicated for people to understand, but still they passed. And the idea of it was very popular with people. But I think it takes a long time to get away from sort of the inherent mistrust of the redistricting process. When you hear about gerrymandering, you hear about, frankly, Ohio and all the times you have to go back to the court with maps and that sort of thing. So we had to overcome that a little bit.
Amanda, could you tell me a little bit about kind of the criteria? So like when you were thinking about what it was, not just who would serve and kind of trying to figure out how to eliminate, use your bingo ball, but like what, can you tell us a little bit about the specific criteria?
Sorry, for choosing commissioners or for drawing maps?
It's for drawing maps. So what are the rules for drawing maps? And obviously we talked about the transparency. We talked a little bit about the selection. This is like, how did, we have all sorts of fairly complicated rules about political subdivisions and obviously a prohibition on gerrymandering. I just wondered a little bit about kind of what kind of criteria you have.
Yeah.
I have a slide that I could
Perfect.
put up.
I was going to say we had bullet points.
Are you able to
Sure,
share?
you should be able to. Yep.
There we go.
Yep. So we had
Sorry.
Oh, it was there for a minute.
There we go.
There we go. Right. So we had these big picture, equal population, needs to be contiguous, complying with the VRA. And we also had a priority around communities of interest that I don't know that was communicated as closely. There was a campaign to pass these amendments. And I think for one of the funders of that campaign, competitiveness was very, very important. And so in a lot of the marketing for, or a lot of the persuasion pieces that you saw when these initiatives were on the ballot was around competitiveness. And I think that that sort of rose a little higher than the way it's written in our Constitution. But there was these big picture guidelines given.
Are there things that you would have liked to add, you know, once you went through the process? Were there additional criteria that you think, or one criterion that you think would have helped the process?
I think we got the criteria right. I just would have liked, you know, most people have never heard the term of art, communities of interest, let alone thought about what those might be. And so I would have loved to have the commissioners get a little bit deeper dive and training on communities of interest and what those might look like. In a perfect world, if I had had an unlimited budget, I think I would have been in every like high school and university in the state a year in advance talking about redistricting, because there are free platforms, right? There's like Dave's Redistricting out there that people can use and did use to submit maps in Colorado. But really anyone can do this. And I think it would have been really exciting to have a much bigger picture coming in from the public. So I think I would have liked to seen better education for commissioners around communities of interest, and more communities of interest themselves understanding how the process works and getting involved.
So one of the things that folks are interested in has to do with prison gerrymandering. And so what happened with the census count and your folks in prison?
Yeah, so our initiatives very intentionally took politicians and the legislature out of the process. The legislature had passed a bill saying that Colorado wouldn't prison gerrymander, right? Would count people at their homes instead of where they are incarcerated. And ultimately that was not allowed, right? That it was not the legislature's role to pass that kind of guidance for the commission, that they were independent commissions. And so then the commissions themselves got to decide, where are we counting people? Are we counting people in the place where they're incarcerated, or are we counting people in the place that they identify as their permanent home? And this was one of the places that we had amazing testimony. We had a gentleman who had been formerly incarcerated, who it was really important to him that his voice be heard in his home community. He was active, you know, in his kids' sports, PTA, and wanted to make sure that he had a voice in the policies that would affect him and his family. And those were the policies that were in Denver, not where he was incarcerated. And so I think that was really meaningful to the commissioners, and it was really important to have people speak about their lived experience. And like I said, ultimately, one commission went one way and one commission went a different way. So if that was something that we see as important to, you know, the residents of Ohio, it might be something that you would think about putting in your initial, you know, legislation.
So one of the questions that was specifically for you, Amanda, so sorry, had to do with kind of school districts and keeping school districts together. You know, there are lots of ways to think about like what are communities and like what is a community of interest and political subdivisions. But one of the ways, as we were doing some of the community mapping, and Trevor Martin, who's on here, did community mapping with a bunch of people. One of the things that really came, you know, it was one of those things that people really cared about was keeping their school district together.
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about what you think.
Right, a school district can obviously be a community of interest. And I believe that Colorado did hear testimony from people advocating to keep their school district whole. Of course, the commissioners are balancing a whole bunch of communities of interest. And so I think that part is just kind of underlines what I was saying about having people understand the process and be active in it, because, you know, the commissioners, they're not everybody, right? They can't see all angles. And so they are really reliant on the public to bring them information about what's important to you as somebody who's part of that school district or part of a community of interest that you want to keep whole. And the only way that commissioners hear about it is if you're engaged in the process and let them know about your community. Jessica, I think you were going to say something too.
just that as staff, when we were drawing, we listened to the comments from the public and really tried to pay attention to those boundaries for communities of interest, and some of them were competing. So then it was up to the commissioners to decide which one sort of wins out. And that's a little frustrating when you hear, literally the same number of people saying opposite things about Routt County, for instance, and whether Steamboat should be with the rest of Routt County or not, or so just these things that you hear that are different. But everybody who had a hand in mapping was listening to what the public was saying and trying really hard to keep school districts together, keep political subdivisions together. In one case, we heard from the public that we had split a retirement community, and they were really upset about that. And so we made some funny looking lines to keep that retirement community together. And so we really did listen. It's just sometimes in certain situations they were competing, and if they competed, say with the Voting Rights Act, we had to give priority to that. And so there were situations like that. It's just a tough one. There's so many different things that could be considered a community of interest.
Well, you will notice that we're getting very close to 7 p.m. I just wanted to say thank you so much. These kind of conversations really help us think through where it is we want to go with our reform effort. I will admit we'll probably bother you again as we explore things and try to work out the best proposal for Ohio. A big thank you to you all. And with that, Mia, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Very good. Thank you so much. And if you, Amanda and Jessica, look in the Q&A and see any question that you want to just go ahead and answer in the chat, feel free to do that, because there's some additional excellent questions there. I'm going to go, and we really appreciate, as Catherine said, you coming on and joining us. I'm going to make your spotlights go away if I can figure that out in 2 seconds here. And then I'm just gonna give you guys one more little bit of information. Let me see, one more spotlight. There we go. Awesome. I'm gonna share my screen again. Sorry. There we go. So we just wanted to update you. We are still waiting to see if the Supreme Court of the United States is going to take up the lawsuit that was brought forward by the leaders of the GOP legislature here about the congressional map. So that is something we're still waiting. I don't know if you guys saw that, there's some question now as to whether the Supreme Court is going to rule in Moore v. Harper. They asked for some more briefs, but the situation that happened there is that in North Carolina, after the elections, the partisan balance of the court there, this North Carolina Supreme Court flipped. And so they may be looking back into the underlying decision in Moore v. Harper, which would change, might change how the Supreme Court decides to act. So those are some things that are still up in the air for us. But there is kind of growing serious interest in a ballot initiative. I'm sure you all have been seeing former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor kind of in the news talking about a redistricting ballot initiative. And there are various groups that are getting ready to work on an initiative. I know everyone is very impatient. What about Ohio? Ohio is coming. Don't worry, Ohio is coming. But we have to win. So we want to get it totally right. And that's why we're asking our experts from Colorado and Michigan and California, everywhere. We want to know that information that's going to help us get it exactly right. And then I don't know, Catherine, if you want to tell us a little bit about this panel that we are inviting folks to attend next week.
So on the Ides of March, beware the Ides of March, it's also Sunshine Week. We are holding a webinar and the focus really is on the householder trial for the Colorado folks. Our former Speaker of the House is on trial for public corruption and racketeering. And so we've all been following, this trial fairly closely. Both Laura Bischoff and Kathy Ann Kowalski have been going nearly every day to the trial. And the goal of this webinar is to really think about all of what was revealed during the trial and how it can point to ways to create better transparency at the State House, greater transparency in elections, because of course we know that the way that our system is set up, it leads to a bunch of corruption. It fosters misbehavior at minimum.
Absolutely. So this is going to be a powerhouse panel. And speaking of power, Kathy Ann Kowalski is, an expert in, energy policy as well. And that is a big part of this. So we invite you to attend next Wednesday at 7 p.m. And then just our
6
usual
p.m.
links, 6 p.m. Sorry, 6 p.m. Next huddle is April 12th. And we have some links there, including one to donate. Of course, a new ballot initiative is going to take a big push. And so we hope you will join us in supporting fair districts. And that is it, folks. We will send a follow-up tomorrow with a link to a recording and slides. And we want to thank all of you for attending. And we especially want to thank our visitors from Colorado and Catherine. And with that, I will say good evening and thank you.
Thank you so much.